Governor Valentin Resnishenko said, according to reports, destroying no less than 11 houses and other buildings. An official on Wednesday said the nuclear plants may have to be closed down, calling on residents around the area to close to the embattled facility to evacuate for their own safety. Russia and Ukraine have blamed each other for shooting that has happened near the plant and within its perimeter, risking nuclear disaster. Russian military took over the plant soon after their February 24th invasion of Ukraine, but Ukrainian technicians still operate the power station. The search for lots of missing people has been hindered by rain, flash floods and mudslides days after a heavy earthquake shook mountainous southwest China and killed closely 82. The National Weather Service issued a yellow alert until Thursday night, warning of a risk of geological disaster and forecast moderate rain to continue to Friday with torrential rains in some areas. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, on Monday, the 6.8 magnitude earthquake hit about 43 kilometers, 26 miles southeast of the city of Kangding in Sichuan province at depth of 10 kilometers, forcing thousands to be relocated into temporary camps. Reports said 46 people died in Gangxing region near the epicenter, while 36 deaths were reported in neighboring Ya'an city and over 270 others were injured, while the number of missing remained at 35. The People's Liberation Army, paramilitary police and fire rescue missions dispatched over 10,000 workers to the area who continued search operations and landslide cleanup attempts in the remote countryside. On Tuesday, it was reported that above 50,000 people have been evacuated following the earthquake. Also, 243 houses had collapsed and 13,010 have been destroyed. Workers hurried to fix hundreds of kilometers of power and optical cables with communications in affected areas basically restored as of Thursday. So far, local authorities have collected 100 million yuan, that's $14 million in disaster relief donations, the report said, and the Sichuan government delivered an emergency notice demanding local authorities to dish out hardship allowances for affected people. And on health, a new report by United Nations agency has warned that back-to-back global crises have set back human development by 5 years. On Thursday, the United Nations Development Programme UNDP said for the first time since its creation in 1990, the Human Development Index HDI has declined for 2 consecutive years straight in 2020 and 2021 amidst crises such as COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, HDI being a measure of countries' life expectancies, educational levels and standards of living. The Human Development Index HDI has gradually risen for decades, but started sliding in 2020 and continued its fall last year, wiping out the advances of the previous 5 years, the paper said. The coronavirus pandemic was a key driver of the drop, but the report noted a combination of crises, which includes political, financial, and climate-related, have not allowed time for populations to recover. While some countries had started improving from the pandemic, numerous others in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and the Caribbean had not yet returned the corner before a fresh crisis hit: the war in Ukraine. Close to occupied West Bank city of Ramallah, Israeli forces have murdered a Palestinian youth. The Palestinian Ministry of Health identified him as 17-year-old Haitham Hani Mubarak. On Thursday, near the Israeli military DCO checkpoints at the northern entrance to Ramallah in the central West Bank, he was shot dead just after midnight. According to the official for the Palestinian Authority, Wafa said the Israeli army had reinforced their military presence at the checkpoint and were stopping vehicles and checking residency cards. The Israeli army said in a statement a suspect attacked an Israeli soldier with a hammer before they killed him. The soldier was wounded in the face and received medical treatment on the spot, the statement said. The Palestinian man is the newest killed by the Israeli army in the West Bank, with Israel conducting near everyday attacks on Palestinian towns and cities. According to Palestinian Ministry of Health, Israeli forces have killed over 140 Palestinians in the 1967 occupied territories so far in 2022, including 49 people murdered during Israel's recent 3-day offensive on the Gaza Strip. 19 people have also been killed in raids carried out by Palestinians in Israel and the West Bank in 2022. Now, the Solomon Islands Parliament has passed a bill to postpone the next general election in spite of objections by opposition party members who had accused Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare of a power grab. On Thursday, the bill, which passed with 37 votes in favor to 10 against, although 2 politicians were absent, changed the constitution to permit the next general election to be delayed until 2024 from 2023. Sogavare argued that the Solomons could not effectively host both the Pacific Games and an election in 2023 because of logistical requirements. He earlier argued that it will be too expensive to hold the regional athletics meeting from which China is building 7 venues and stadiums and a general election in the same year. We cannot afford to present a country that is politically unstable, he said on Thursday, adding an election after May 2023 will be too close to the November sporting games. The Prime Minister said he was rushing the legislation through Parliament because of the risk of protests. The Chamber of Commerce in the Pacific Archipelago and called for public tranquil to steer clear a recurrence of November crisis in which shops in capital Honiara's Chinatown were burned down by protesters angry with Sogavare's government. Cabinet members told Parliament that while the election is postponed, the Solomon Islands will have a caretaker government for 4 months in 2024. Sogavare denied any democratic ideologies have been broken by changing the constitution, and he criticized the media for reporting of the issue. Rick Hu, former Prime Minister, said delaying the election was morally wrong, and opposition members have asked Sogavare's justification for looking to postpone the vote. Opposition leader Matthew Wale said there was never any need to pick between holding the elections and hosting the Pacific Games. Electorate he consulted had rejected the proposed delay, said Wale, who described the rescheduling of the election as a power grab by the Prime Minister. A more story says the United Nations says it has credible reports of Ukraine children relocated to Russia. The United Nations said there are reliable accusations that Russian forces have sent Ukrainian children to Russia for adoption as part of a larger-scale forced evacuation and deportation program. Assistant United Nations Secretary General for Human Rights Isaac Brant-Carey told a meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Wednesday that Russia forces are also running filtration operations in which Ukrainians in occupied territories face methodical security checks that have involved numerous human rights violations. We are concerned that the Russian authorities have adopted a simplified procedure to grant Russian citizenship to children without parental care, and that these children will not be eligible for adoption by Russian families, she said. The filtration measures of Ukrainian adults judged as close to the Ukraine government or military have involved torture and the forcible removal and transfer to Russian penal colonies and other detention centers, Kerry said. In cases that our office has documented during infiltration, Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups have endangered persons to body searches, sometimes involving forced nudity and detailed interrogations about the personal background, family ties, political views, and allegiances of the individual concerned. We are particularly concerned that women and girls are at risk of sexual abuse during filtration procedures, she added. Court finds 5 guilty of treason over ship books in Hong Kong. A Hong Kong court has found 5 speech therapists guilty of treason over a sequence of illustrated children's books that depicted the city's democracy supporters as sheep defending their village from wolves. The charges linked to 3 books targeted at children aged between 4 and 7 years old: The Guardians of Sheep Village, The 12 Heroes of Sheep Village, and The Garbage Collectors of Sheep Village. Prosecutors claim the 3 picture books, which sought to describe Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement to youngsters, spread separatism and stir up hatred and opposition to the government. Lorelei Melody Young, Sydney Nung, Samuel Chan, and Marco Fong, aged between 25 and 28, are all members of a speech therapist union, had pledged not guilty. Choosing not to attest during the trial or summon any witnesses when proceedings started in July, their lawyers argued that the sedition offense was unclearly defined and that each reader should be permitted to make up their own mind about what the characters in the book represent, warning that a guilty judgment will add criminalized political criticism and have a chilling consequence on the society. It is the first time that the case of a seditious publication has gone to trial since the protests that hit the territory in 2019 and Beijing's imposition of a national security law the following year. The treason law since 1967, which dates from colonial times, had not been used before it was revitalized in the awakening of the mass protests. Their plots relate to several real-life events, including the 2019 protests, a failed effort by a group of 12 protesters to flee to Taiwan by speedboat, and a strike by medical doctors at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, calling for Hong Kong to close its border with China. District Court Judge Kwok Wei Kin, in a written summary released on Wednesday, said all three books were seditious, not simply from the words, but from the words with the prescribed effects intended in the mind of children. In Africa, African nations meet in Egypt to prepare ahead of COP27. Ahead of the annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, Climate Summit in November, African ministers of finance, economy and the environment met in Egypt this week. Host country Egypt needs to take on a leading role by calling time on unfulfilled promises that have left African countries excessively battered by climate change. Yasmin Ford, Egypt's Minister of Environment, said Egypt should play this role to represent the African continent, and it requires clear and explicit: we were not the cause of these emissions, but it is our people and our natural resources that are affected. At this point, a position must be taken on the international community to say that everyone must fulfill their obligations as set out in the Paris Agreement. The African continent releases only around 3% of global CO2 emissions, but is disproportionately affected by worsening droughts and floods. Funding to assist poorer countries control their emissions and reinforce their resilience will be a major flashpoint at COP27, as a long-standing aim to spend $100 billion a year from 2020 on supporting weak nations acclimatized to environmental change remains unmet. This week's forum in Egypt plans to leverage African leader voices to mobilize larger international funding for a green and resilient recovery in Africa, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It also pursues to drum up funding to aid vulnerable countries reduce greenhouse gas emissions. After alleged coup plot, President of Burundi names new Prime Minister. On Wednesday, Evariste Ndayishimiye, Burundi's President, replaced his Prime Minister and a highest aide in a top-level rearrangement after warning of a coup plot against him. Security Minister Javier Kubuka was sworn in before Parliament as the new premier of the Central African nation. He succeeded Alain Guillaume, who was dismissed, along with Ndayishimiye's civilian Chief of Staff General Gabriel Nizigama, in the first major rearrangement since the president took office a little over 2 years ago. Lawmakers approved the appointment of Diribuka's former chief of Burundi's Fed Intelligence Agency in an agreed 113-0 vote at a speedily called parliamentary session earlier on Wednesday. Ndayishimiye, a 54-year-old former army general, gave no explanations for Bunyoni's dismissal, but last week he had cautioned of a revolution against his government. The fate of Bunyoni, a former police chief and security minister who has long been a senior person in the governing CNDD-FDD party, was not instantly known. Legislators had been called to be present at the National Assembly session on Wednesday through urgent messages sent overnight via WhatsApp. Analysts say a cabal of military leaders known as the generals exercise the true political power in Burundi, and the president himself had indicated his isolation in a 2021 speech. Burundi has been in the grasp of an economic crisis since the 2015 unrest, with a lack of foreign exchange and shortages of essential goods such as fuel, certain foodstuffs, building materials, and medicines. Last week, Ndayishimiye repeated his pledges to break down powers given to leaders and those close to the government. Earlier on Wednesday, Burundi's Trade Ministry declared the reduction of imports of maize flour, sugar and cement in a statement on Twitter dated September 6th. It follows the import of fuel by a state firm in the last 10 days, meaning petrol stations can be filled up. Brussels and Washington in February recommenced aid flows to the landlocked nation after lessening the 2015 sanctions, citing political advancement under Ndayishimiye. Civil society groups have returned. The BBC is permitted to broadcast again, and the European Union, Burundi's major foreign donor, has commended attempts to fight corruption. But worries over rights abuses remain. In May, Human Rights Watch criticized politically motivated murders and kidnapping by police and state-backed youth groups, while a United Nations inquiry last year characterized the situation as disastrous. And finally, German forces recommences MINUSMA reconnaissance mission in Mali. Germany has recommenced reconnaissance patrols in eastern Mali as part of a United Nations peacekeeping mission known as MINUSMA. The military said Wednesday after halting the operations last month when the Malian government denied flyover rights. A military spokeswoman said in a statement, reconnaissance operations outside the city of Gao resumes yesterday, Tuesday. Most German forces in Mali are based close to Gao. The Defense Ministry on August 12 said it had suspended reconnaissance and connected operations after Mali's ruling junta denied permission for flights to aid personnel rotation under the United Nations MINUSMA mission. In Wednesday's statement, the military said a unit which newly arrived in Gao was now fully ready to work and had taken over the task of securing the camp. MINUSMA, the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, was launched in 2013 to help Mali deal with a bloody jihadi campaign. The row broke out as Mali's junta turns away from France and toward Russia in its fight against jihadism. The long-running insurgency has claimed thousands of lives and forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. The relationship between Bamako and Paris, its former colonial power and traditional ally, has declined in recent months. The arrival of Russian paramilitaries in the country on the invitation of the government was a major factor in France's decision to pull its military forces out. A recap of our major stories: new shelling near Russian-held nuclear plants in Ukraine. In China, rain and landslide hinders earthquake rescue mission. The United Nations says human development drops back to 2016 levels by COVID or the crisis. Palestinian youth killed by Israeli forces close to Ramallah in West Bank, and Solomon Islands to delay election as opposition cries foul. And that's all for the international news this evening. I am Lois Duraki. Have a good evening.